The air smelled of salt as the transport ship eased toward Yokohama. Dawn sat low over the water, pale and thin. A group of Japanese women stood on the deck. Their uniforms clung to them, worn down by months of hunger and evacuation. A cold wind cut across the harbor. They held their breaths as American military trucks waited on the pier. Among the personnel were women in crisp jackets, members of the Women's Army Corps. The Japanese women watched them with uncertainty. The ship's engines quieted. Ropes tightened. Boots thudded on metal ramps. The first steps onto land felt unreal. Then the American women approached with bundled clothing in their arms. The Japanese women lowered their eyes. Some trembled. The moment felt heavier than surrender. It felt like entering a world they no longer recognized. Japan's formal surrender on the 2nd of September 1945 set in motion a massive repatriation effort. Millions of civilians and military personnel were scattered across the Pacific region. Many had served in Manchuria, Korea, Formosa, the Philippines, and Pacific Islands. Among them were Japanese military nurses and administrative officers. They had endured bombardment, disease, and starvation. By late 1945, Allied transport ships brought them back in waves to ports under American control. Yokohama became one of the largest reception points. The Imperial Japanese Army Nurse Corps, established in the late 19th century, had been expanded during the war. Many assigned officers were women who held ranks equivalent to their male counterparts. Their job was to stabilize wounded soldiers, manage medical stations, and support field hospitals. As Japan's situation collapsed in 1944 and 1945, supply routes failed. Medical personnel were left with limited food, no antibiotics, and dwindling bandages. Many officers survived on minimal rations. The American occupation forces faced urgent tasks. They had to stop disease outbreaks, distribute food, and manage returning populations. The Women's Army Corps, already experienced in logistics and civil affairs, worked under General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. Female personnel were tasked with registration, medical checks, and humanitarian coordination. They were instructed to maintain discipline, yet treat all returnees humanely. American policy stressed stabilization. Japan needed calm for reconstruction. Repatriated women often arrived in clothing shredded by months of wear. Some had not changed garments for weeks. Many had fled from Soviet advances in Manchuria or from collapsing garrisons in the Philippines. Exposure, malnutrition, and exhaustion left clear marks. American warehouses stored relief supplies shipped by the United States and the Red Cross. Boxers contained shirts, coats, blankets, and simple dresses. Female American personnel were assigned to distribute them because officials believed it would reduce tension. Cultural barriers remained significant. Japanese women returning from military service carried guilt and uncertainty. They did not know how occupation troops would treat them. When they stepped into processing tents, they saw medical tables, supply counters, and WAC personnel checking lists. The sight of American women wearing clean uniforms, standing confidently, marked a stark contrast with their own deteriorated condition. The human angle began with hunger. Many repatriated officers had lost extensive weight. Their cheeks were hollow. Hands shook when they held forms. Some carried small cloth bags with their only belongings. Inside were photographs, army notebooks, or a pair of worn sandals. They had lived through evacuation, transport, air raids, and nights without shelter. Simple routines like washing or sewing had become impossible. When the American women handed out new garments, the emotions were immediate. Tears appeared before words formed. A few tried to bow an apology for accepting help. Others covered their faces. The act of receiving clothes symbolized survival more than charity. It was the first moment in months when they felt safe. The WAC personnel noticed this reaction repeatedly. Reports noted quiet sobbing in the distribution lines. American nurses documented cases of anemia, dehydration, and widespread lice infestation. The Japanese women cooperated fully. They understood that survival required accepting aid from former enemies. The tactical angle shaped the repatriation program. The occupation command aimed to process thousands daily. Speed mattered. Crowded ports risked disease outbreaks. Medical stations checked for tuberculosis, dysentery, malaria, and influenza. Teams separated the sick from general returnees. Clothing distribution had a tactical purpose. Clean garments reduced contagion. The issue of new clothing allowed delousing procedures to work effectively. Logistics officers ensured constant flow of supplies. Repatriation ships traveled under tight schedules because American fleet assets were needed elsewhere. The goal was to avoid bottlenecks. Japanese administrative officers assisted by translating instructions and guiding returnees. Cooperation increased steadily because the occupation authorities enforced strict but fair policies. The presence of WAC personnel improved efficiency. Women felt more comfortable undergoing screenings when attended by female staff. This eased tension in processing areas. The technological angle appeared in the machinery of relief. Allied transport ships used improved desalination systems, allowing more fresh water for washing and cooking. Mobile field kitchens distributed calorie-dense meals calibrated to treat malnutrition safely. Medical teams relied on American-produced sulfa drugs to manage infections among the returnees. Portable X-ray units screened for lung disease. Delousing chambers used standardized chemical treatments that removed lice without injuring skin. The clothing itself came from mass production lines across the United States. Civilian factories that had produced uniforms switched to relief goods in late 1945. Ships carried these supplies across the Pacific. Cold weather coats proved vital for women arriving in early winter. The efficient movement of boxes from docks to warehouses and to distribution tents reflected improved wartime logistics. The Japanese women saw this system and realized how different American supply methods were compared to those of the collapsing Japanese military. The enemy perspective angle documented internal conflict. For many Japanese officers, surrender remained a painful subject. They had served under an ideology that demanded loyalty unto death. Seeing American personnel, especially women, giving them aid produced complicated reactions. Some felt shame, others felt relief. Stronger than any ideology, they recognized that the enemy had the resources to feed and clothe them. Their own government could no longer provide. Many feared harsh treatment, but found calm and methodical procedures instead. This contrast reshaped perceptions. Reports from U.S. military observers noted that Japanese women often apologized repeatedly during processing. WAC personnel often responded with simple instructions, not emotional statements. This professional tone reduced fear. Japanese officers later reported that the experience challenged their wartime image of Americans. They remembered the kindness of receiving a coat or a pair of shoes at a moment when they felt stripped of identity. The turning point came in late 1945 and early 1946, when repatriation numbers reached their peak. Ships arrived almost daily. The strain on facilities grew intense. One arrival day recorded more than 20,000 returnees at Yokohama and Uraga combined. Lines stretched across the piers. The humanitarian system had to adjust. Warehouse supplies ran low at several points. American staff scheduled emergency deliveries from other bases. At one station, more than 300 Japanese women officers and nurses arrived after fleeing Manchuria during the Soviet invasion. Their uniforms were nearly unrecognizable after months of travel. Many carried frostbite injuries. When they stepped into the processing tent, they met WAC personnel who had been briefed on their condition. The American women moved quickly. They handed out coats first, then blankets. A medical team recorded vital signs. Several Japanese nurses began crying simultaneously when offered clean clothing. The sound filled the tent but did not disrupt the process. They cried because the garments represented safety. They cried because months of terror were ending. They cried because the hands offering help belonged to women of the nation they had been trained to fear. The WAC personnel recorded these reactions in daily logs. One entry noted that nearly all Japanese female officers on that transport broke down upon receiving new shoes. Their feet had been swollen from walking long distances during evacuation. Shoes meant dignity. The sudden availability of simple items like socks created emotional release. American commanders noticed the impact. The humanitarian approach softened resistance and sped cooperation. Disease rates dropped as clean clothes replaced infested garments. Japanese health officials studying the process later acknowledged that the clothing distribution was a turning point in restoring basic public hygiene. The Japanese press covered repatriation cautiously. Articles avoided political interpretation but described the efficiency of American-run facilities. This influenced broader society. Civilians understood that former military personnel were receiving structured support. It reduced fear of returnees spreading illness or unrest. Japanese women officers often spoke quietly among themselves after receiving aid. They discussed survival, loss, and the collapse of everything they had trained for. Many had served near front lines where medical units were overrun. They carried memories of wounded soldiers without supplies. Some had burned medical records during retreats to prevent intelligence leaks. Their service promised loyalty to an empire that no longer existed. As they stood in distribution lines, they watched American women work with steady movements, checking names, handing coats, giving instructions. The contrast marked a shift in power. The Japanese women were no longer military personnel. They were civilians relying on the occupation authority. The realization often triggered further tears. It was the emotional weight of transition from war to peace. The aftermath unfolded across 1946 and 1947. Repatriation continued until most personnel returned home. The Japanese government, under occupation supervision, created measures to reintegrate former military nurses into civilian hospitals. Many carried long-term health issues. Some suffered from chronic malnutrition. A number died within months of returning due to untreated wounds or infections acquired during evacuation. American medical support reduced mortality, but could not reverse all damage. Clean clothing reduced lice-borne diseases. The spread of typhus declined. Relief distribution stabilized urban areas already weakened by bombing. Tokyo and Yokohama faced severe housing shortages. Many returnees lived temporarily in makeshift shelters. Clothing remained scarce in post-war Japan. American and Red Cross donations continued through local welfare offices. The psychological aftermath shaped perceptions on both sides. For the Japanese women officers, the memory of American women giving them clothes stayed vivid. It symbolized a moment when former enemies replaced fear with structured assistance. For the WAC personnel, the experience became a case study in humanitarian occupation policy. Their actions helped stabilize communities and maintain order. American reports emphasized that respectful treatment led to faster cooperation. Japanese civilian leaders studied the repatriation system as they rebuilt health services and welfare structures. The broader strategic impact appeared in Japan's reconstruction. Improved hygiene reduced medical crises in major cities. Repatriated medical officers helped rebuild hospital networks. Their experiences abroad shaped new training standards. Some wrote accounts describing the collapse of wartime medical logistics. Their testimonies informed post-war debates on healthcare reform. Social trust gradually increased as returnees reintegrated into families and workplaces. Many were welcomed home, but some faced stigma due to their former roles. Clothing distribution, although a small detail, became a symbol of shared humanity. It showed that survival required cooperation beyond wartime loyalties. The event taught the world a simple lesson. The end of conflict does not erase suffering. Victory does not replace duty to those who endured war's collapse. Humanitarian relief at ports like Yokohama showed that former enemies could take measured steps toward stability. Clothing given by American women to Japanese women carried no political message. It met a basic need at a critical moment. It also showed that recovery begins with actions that restore dignity. Historians studying the occupation note that such small encounters shaped long-term relations. The tears of those Japanese officers were not signs of defeat. They were signs of exhaustion. Lifting, they were signs that a fractured nation had begun its return to normal life.